It's time for us to get underway with learning about individualism and collectivism. This is week 4, and we have quite a bit to adjust to. So let's go ahead and get right underway with learning about individualism and collectivism. For some of you, you do remember that we had an assignment to make a list with 3 columns having to do with all of the friends that you can remember embracing over the years in column 1. Column 2 is a list of all the friends that you know of that are a different race. And the 3rd column is listing all of the friends of a different race that you've become best friends with. So we are going to discuss this a little bit and hopefully utilize this as a way to expand a bit of diversity in our lives. Okay? Way. We're going to move into the area of learning more about the connection of the cultural context of the intercultural communication styles and what that involves. So let's get underway with learning some new terms and information. Some of the learning objectives that we will be working with will have to do with learning to recognize the different collectivity perspectives. There's a lot of information for us to glean from this, and we will get new perspectives of what researchers and the notions behind pan-cultural types of communication and self-awareness that we can be more aware of. Additionally, we're going to learn to identify some of the cultures that have this high context and some of the high and low context and the variables that exist within that. And then we're going to also look into comparing the different values having to do with cultures and certain expectations that I think you might be able to appreciate learning with regard to the values in communication. Additionally, we're going to talk about the small power clashes and power distant cultures that exist, and additionally learn and identify some of the weaknesses and things to avoid within the uncertainties of intercultural communication. Okay, now I have a video that I'd like for you to watch, so let's take a look.
The main difference between individualistic and collectivist cultures concerns responsibility. In individualistic cultures, people are responsible for themselves. People are free to pursue their own lives with as little interference as possible from outside. Individual rights and equality in the law, along with privacy, are essential features of these kinds of cultures. Every single individual is sovereign to themselves, and they are only obstructed when they interfere with the sovereignty of others. In collective cultures, the well-being of the group is given priority over the individuals that belong to them. In collective cultures, the group is responsible for the actions of the individual, as well as their safety and welfare.
Okay, that gives us a great understanding about the differences between the two. So let's get right back into learning about our lesson today. And let's see what we have here. Okay, so now we'll just move right on to learning a little bit more about some of the theories behind this concept. We're going Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can spotlight a little bit more of what this actually looks like as these two entities, do they coexist in the way we look at it, or are they exclusive or different? Well, individualism and collectivism are not mutually exclusive. Keep in mind that individuals can be characterized really more specifically as combinations of individualist and collectivism type of tendencies. We look at within family members and relationships versus business relationships. Those are some examples where we can find that individual relationships are motivated in and by particular situations. Okay, so moving on a little bit more, who's who? Let's get some overall information about who do we really perceive globally as having individualism framework or a mindset that way. So we look at some of the countries such as, of course, the United States. Our text shares that Germany, India, Lebanon, New Zealand, Peru, Brazil, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, and Argentina tend to be overall individualism thinkers. So that gives us some great perspective as to the difference of that mindset of individuals that think a certain way. And I think this is a really good illustration in order to give us some examples. Let's look at some of the behavioral traits that could be associated with these two entities. For example, those of the Western mindset, Western world globally, tend to think, as we mentioned, individually, and they have really high self-esteem. They have areas that they're very optimistic, and they also tend to be satisfied with themselves and their goals. They appreciate having this freedom and free thinking. They have a real ease, really, with interacting with strangers and others because they're always hoping to glean new information and sharing thought processes. Additionally, they have low social anxieties, which is very interesting. They don't mind getting to know other individuals, and they know that they have a place, and they strive to find that as individuals. There is a preference to work alone often, seeking that independence and being free thinkers. We tend to do that, whereas in the collectivism society, it's somewhat the opposite. They tend to need some type of affiliation with others. They're very sensitive to rejection, and they don't want to be embarrassed. We often hear of the term, within Asia, specifically China, and you hear of losing face. They shy away from putting themselves in situations where that might be a cause of embarrassment or to lose face. They are very proud of the group relationship. They like that as a preference. They identify to that group or collective way of thinking. They really are valuing the social network. So, I find it very interesting that me being in China during the time of the explosion of social media and apps, phone apps, and, ways of communicating group, with we know like TikTok, of course, is a new upcoming, very popular format. And in China, we use WeChat and Facebook, these type of, they don't use Facebook in China, but we here in Western states do. And, but they really do like the value of that social networking process. So, okay, now I have a short video clip that I want to share with you having to do with learning about what is the difference between a high context and low context culture. Okay, here we go.
It has been said that when Americans want to say 100 things, they will verbalize 150 things, for they are explicit in their use of language in communication. When the Japanese verbalize 70 things, they are trying to get the other person to understand 100, for they are using implicit understandings and at times nonverbal cues to get their point across. Cultures can be separated into two groups with regard to communication. High context cultures such as East Asian, Latin American, Southern Mediterranean, and Arab countries were commonly homogeneous, sharing a history of common values and assumptions. When people of high context cultures communicate, it is not necessary for them to say everything explicitly. Nonverbal cues often communicate what is not said, and silence can have great meaning. In parallel to this are low context cultures, such as America, Canada, and Western European countries. These communicators prefer clear descriptions, unambiguous communication, and are highly specific. Low context communicators do not rely or trust relationships in business communication. Instead, they rely more on the spoken or written word. So how can we bridge this communication gap? The gap is more about the language of behavior than language use itself, and it can be bridged by focusing on the key necessary to unlocking business in any form and at any level: relationships. High context cultures value relationship. Knowing the history and character of who they are communicating with influences what is communicated and how. A solid relationship supports a high context culture's natural implicit communication preference. Thus, it is an advantage to devote time and attention to relationship building when working with high context cultures. Being aware low context communicators may be perceived as moving too fast or as too direct and abrupt informs low context communicators to slow down, approach communication through developing understanding rather than just by giving specific explanations. Letting relationships percolate before trying to seal or even propose an outcome will create not only better communication, but better results as well.
Wow, I really did enjoy that video. I think she did an excellent job in conveying the message of the importance of how we truly communicate. So let's move on to any questions that might be out there. This would be a good time to bring up any of those questions. Okay, here we go. Moving right along. Okay, the next area that I want to introduce to you has to do with this horizontal and vertical context of communication. So as we can see on this, this graph here, if you will, this plot, we see that there is the vertical area that has a lot to do with hierarchy. Maybe it's top-down leadership, etc. And then we have the horizontal orientation which emphasizes equality and perhaps that type of group environment. So I thought it would be interesting to show you a little short clip about what this looks like with regard to the spectrum of
it's really time that we open up to questions.
Globalization.
From the audience. So I will read, it's not addressed to a particular person, so I just ask whoever wants to reply should do so. The question reads, incentive reward models for collective intelligence. Simple, healthier people. But what metrics are used to measure the impact of contributions? So this has disappeared now. How to reward in the 12-year cycle of drug discovery?
Yes. First of all, in the People Olympics, I'm trying to move from the reward as an individual mercantilistic concept to a collective reward. So what you are really doing when the 10,000 people are competing against the other 10,000, the other many cities, is that they want their collectivity to win. And I want the town altogether, according to its profile, demographic profile, to increase the physical activity. So everybody wins. But also, that this is the game, the competition part of it, the prize is not to the champion, because the champion happens the same thing in sport as in profit, is always trying to trick, because he is very challenging to increase yet another little centimeter or a portion of a second. So most of the time we hear that they are on drugs to do that. Like companies are on drugs to do also that. And most of the time we discover that something is wrong with it. Why? Because again, that the attention is toward the excellence. It's the wrong attitude. This is a cultural shift again. You must look at the average, because the average will change and solve the problem of the world. And it's not going to be the pointed excellence. So the whole scheme of reward should be revised. Have you helped your team? Have you helped your town? Very good, because the winner is the town, the winner is the team.
Okay, we're going to just stop there on this particular illustration. They do give some, you know, collectively, this would really look at that horizontal, viewpoint having to do with the group environment. So I just wanted to share a little perspective with you on that, whereas we see that this horizontal, the in-group is very effective with regard to how the individuals that are on the individualism format tends to view that collectivity. Okay, so now that we're getting a clear understanding of this this new area of pancultural self, it has to do with maybe looking into self-enhancement, which really refers to this idea that people desire to maintain and, really keep up this strong, affirmative, positive self-view. And, this self-protection is this idea, which is the opposite, which we look at it as, it means really to minimize the negative self-view. So, these are just some ways of looking at the difference between how we tend to self-enhance or self-protect who we are. And this does take place, culturally as well. So it gives us a better idea of how to look into these ways of the term pancultural. So let's take a minute to take some questions and get clarification on this. Okay, while I prepare the next slide, I'd like to know if anyone does have any questions or point of clarification. This would be a great time to go ahead and
Personality is more than just genes. A large part of who we are and the decisions that we make are influenced by the culture that we grew up in. So where does this influence start? Think all the way back to when you learned manners. You were probably scolded for engaging in behavior that was considered rude in your culture. Conversely, you were probably encouraged to engage in behaviors that are considered to be polite. Now, as you were conditioned to engage in more polite behaviors, you subconsciously picked up on patterns that influenced how you behave. These patterns are highly influenced by the values of the culture that you grew up in. But not all cultures hold the same values. Some cultures tend to encourage behaviors that are loud, boisterous, and competitive. Others encourage quiet, respectful, and more humble behaviors. Depending on the culture where you live, you probably picked up on these values, and they have definitely influenced your decisions and your personality. Researchers have been studying the connections between culture and personality for a long time, and in this video I'm going to attempt to explain two spectrums that researchers have created to define cultures. The culture's place on these spectrums highly influences the personality traits and the behaviors of the people within that culture. So culture is not determined by borders. As you'll see throughout the rest of this video, people learn lessons from cultures that are created from people within a certain country, occupation, class, gender identity, or other differences. For example, just because the country you live in has an individualist culture does not mean you are bound by individualist ideas. So keep this in mind throughout the rest of the video. Let's get started by talking about individual versus collectivist culture. Individualism focuses on the individual, just as the name implies. People living in an individualist environment prioritize self-improvement of themselves and satisfying their own needs before the rest of those of their community. Why? Well, individualist cultures believe and teach that if everyone takes care of themselves, then the entire group should thrive and then become self-sufficient. Individualist cultures put a lot of stress on independence and self-reliance. Those that live in this type of culture tend to be very self-sufficient and driven workers, but are weaker whenever it comes to collaboration and teamwork. They usually struggle handing off responsibility. Now, in general, these people usually distance themselves psychologically and emotionally from one another, since working with others is more of an option than a requirement for success. In the media, we often see individualist characteristics associated with men, people in urban settings, and the Western culture. So what about collectivist cultures? People living in a collectivist environment are taught to focus on the needs of the group before they focus on their own individual needs. They associate their identity to the role and function in a larger group. These groups can include families, teams at work, or the entire nation. Collectivist societies teach people that everyone will benefit when they start to look out for one another. Harmony and interdependence between group members is highly valued among people in this type of environment. Now, unlike their individualist counterparts, members of collectivist cultures tend to be extremely close to each other psychologically and emotionally. Now, this can create an us versus them mindset that separates or looks down upon people that are outside of their group. Collectivist characteristics are generally associated with women, people in rural settings, and Eastern culture. So let's look at another spectrum. Did you grow up in an approach or an avoidance culture? This idea was coined in 1935 to help psychologists identify what makes some conflicts easy to resolve and others difficult to resolve. Where you lie on this spectrum can highly influence how you make decisions. So, what is approach versus avoidance? Humans typically want to approach and move towards pleasurable things, and they typically want to avoid and move away from negative or painful things. It's very similar to Freud's pleasure-pain principle. The idea of approach versus avoidance was measured when an experiment was conducted on rats in 1948. The rats were exposed to different positive and negative stimuli. Researchers then measured the strength of their pull towards the stimuli. The most interesting results from this experiment revealed that the closer the rats were to the item that they were either approaching or avoiding, the stronger their pull was in either direction. Now, this can be applied to humans and how they make their decisions and categorize conflict. But what does it have to do with the culture where you grew up with? Because that's kind of the topic of this video, right? The culture helps to teach you at a young age what to approach and what to avoid. Culture doesn't teach you to avoid physical pain and approach food. Those things are instinctual to all humans. The things we learn to approach and avoid through culture appeal to a higher need. One example of this is something called uncertainty avoidance. The uncertainty avoidance of a culture is a measure of how that culture responds to novelty and uncertainty. How does a culture deal with ambiguity? Are changes welcome in the nation, or does the culture approach stable, traditional rules and customs? Now, in some research, I've found that countries who generally score high in neuroticism tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance. Those countries usually have a more formal system of rules that try to minimize cultural or situational ambiguity, and the citizens are uninterested in changing them. These cultures tend to be more conservative, more emotional, and usually xenophobic. Families in these cultures tend to have more traditional gender roles too. Schools have more structured learning, and children are taught to trust that their teachers have all of the answers. Children are also taught that the outside world may be a hostile place. Religions associated with the uncertainty avoidance include Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and Shintoism. Conversely, countries low in neuroticism and low in uncertainty avoidance tend to have fewer laws and regulations, and their citizens are much more interested in politics. These cultures are often more open to change and more tolerant of diversity, and people within these cultures tend to suppress their emotions more. Families in these cultures usually have looser gender roles, and their schools have a more open-minded learning. As a generality, teachers are allowed to say that they don't know, and students are encouraged to question authority. Children are also taught that the outside world is benevolent and that they should not persecute others based on their beliefs. Religions associated with low uncertainty avoidance include Protestantism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. So where do you fit in? Uncertainty avoidance is just one concept that is influenced by a culture's personality and how it influences the decisions and behaviors of the people within that culture. What were you taught to avoid? What were you taught to approach? And how does the culture where you grew up in influence what you consider to be comfortable and uncomfortable? I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, feel free to watch some of the other videos in this personality series. And if you want to learn more about your own personality, check out my free 3-in-1 personality quiz in the description below. What it does is it combines 3 of the major personality quizzes into just one test you can take in under 10 minutes. And at the end of it, I'm going to try to predict some things about you, like your political stances, your relationship style, and also your health.
I think this has been a great example of how we can truly incorporate this pan-cultural self-mentality in the framework. The avoidance uncertainty is definitely an area that we need to self-examine as to what causes us to have certain uncertainties. It certainly does matter with regard to developing intercultural relationships with other individuals. So I look forward to utilizing this a little bit more within our semester. Okay. Okay, now we are going to move into learning a little bit more about the high and low context communication. These have to do with certain characteristics. And just to give a brief definition of the high context, it means that the cultural orientation in which the meanings are gleaned from this aspect of the physical, social, and psychological context or point of reference. So that's what is indicated in the high context, whereas in the low context, it states that the cultural orientation in which the meanings are encoded in the verbal code. So let's just give some information with regard to this as far as some general examples. So the textbook gives us a great illustration that one of the researchers, Hall, suggests that if in the illustration of twins, stating that twins who have grown up together can and do communicate more economically, meaning the high contact, whereas two lawyers in a courtroom, such as during an important trial, may have that low context level. So this gives a little bit of information about how we are really, showing these characteristics between the two. And we know that within the high contact culture, we know and understand each other. And so there may be, real appropriate roles that are in place, and where words are not always the only thing that is needed to convey the meaning that we act according to the roles that are represented, more so than absolute of what is being said. So I think that's a really nice illustration of what this could be.
Okay, so take a moment, if you will, just to make sure you write down the definitions and highlight the two characteristics having to do with low context communication and high context communication. If you have any questions, this would be a good time to interject or comment. Okay, this next portion has a little bit more information on the topic of context and how we communicate, more specifically with how our values and they are developed. So let's take a quick look at this bit of information. I think it will.
At the end of 1970s, psychologist Dr. Geert Hofstede published his Cultural Dimensions model. Since then, it's become an internationally recognized standard for understanding cultural differences. He identified 6 dimensions that could distinguish one culture from another. The first one is the Power Distance Index. It measures the extent to which the less powerful members accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Malaysia has the highest score. Team members will not initiate any action, they like to be guided and directed to complete a task. Austria has the lowest score. Supervisors and employees are considered almost as equals. Individualism versus collectivism is the second dimension. It represents the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. Guatemala, the country with the lowest IDV score, has a collectivist culture. People are integrated into strong in groups which continue protecting them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. On the other side, the United States have the highest score. The individualism is perfectly represented by the American dream, which is the hope for a better quality of life and a higher standard of living than their parents. The masculinity versus femininity dimension refers to the distribution of roles between the genders. The study revealed that women's values differ less among societies than men's values. Men's values can be very assertive and competitive, maximally different from women's value, or modest and caring, similar to women's values. Japan has the highest score. If you open an office in Japan, you should recognize you're operating in a hierarchical, deferential and traditionally patriarchal society. Long hours are the norm, and this, in turn, can make it harder for female team members to gain advancement, due to family commitments. At the same time, Japan is a culture where all children learn the value of competition and winning as part of a team from a young age. Therefore, female team members are just as likely to display these notionally masculine traits as their male colleagues. By comparison, Sweden, the country with the lowest score, is a very feminine society. People focus on managing through discussion, consensus, compromise, and negotiation. The Uncertainty Avoidance Index describes how well people can cope with anxiety. Greece is the country with the highest score. During a meeting, you might be keen to generate discussion, because you recognize that there is a cultural tendency for team members to make the safest, most conservative decisions, despite any emotional outbursts. At the other end of the spectrum, Singapore has the lowest score. The country is more open to change or innovation, more inclined to open-ended decision-making and has less sense of urgency. Long-term versus short-term dimension refers to the degree to which people need to explain the inexplicable, and is strongly related to religiosity and nationalism. China, the country with the highest score, has a long-term orientation, which means that the culture is pragmatic, modest and more thrifty. Sierra Leone is the country with the lowest score. People tend to be religious and nationalistic. Self-enhancement is also important here, along with a person's desire to please their parents. The last dimension is indulgence versus restraint. Countries with a high score such as Brazil allow or encourage relatively free gratification of people's own drives and emotions, such as enjoying life and having fun. In a society with a low score like Russia, there is more emphasis on suppressing gratification and more regulation of people's conduct and behavior, and there are stricter social norms. In conclusion, by using Hofstede's cultural dimensions as a starting point, you can make the unknown less intimidating, avoid making mistakes, and provide a much-needed confidence boost when you're working in an unfamiliar country. Above all, make cultural sensitivity a daily part of your life. Learn to value people's differences, and how to respect the things that make people who they are.
Wow, I absolutely love this particular video. It gives us such a upbeat and wonderful perspective having to do with the avoidance, the apprehensive avoidance and uncertainty avoidance is something that we definitely do encounter throughout this exchange in intercultural communication and learning how to work together. So we are about to conclude on today's plethora of information. However, I do have one more bit of information that I would like to share with you, and kind of summarizes what's it all about. Whoops, sorry. Okay, it doesn't want to, just a second. Let's try one more thing. Okay, just a moment. Patience is a virtue, of course. See if it's gonna, here we go. Blessed are the flexible. That's what I'm learning.
I love a good cup of water. Hola, ¿cómo estás? It's me again, Ty Roxon, and here, back again at Use Your Difference, the place to be if you want to take your culture awareness to the next level. So last week we talked about the Power Distance Index. This week we're talking about collectivism versus individualism. If you remember correctly, last week I was telling you how I was a walking contradiction and you had to listen to this. Well, here's how. I come from a collectivist background, and in collectivist societies, people tend to define success and everything in terms of group dynamics. So you hear things like, I'm a good son, we did this, we do that. It's all we. And that, it's just often in cultures like, in Asian cultures, a lot of Asian cultures, a lot of African cultures, and a lot of Latin American cultures. Contrast that with an individualistic society like the US and a lot of Western European countries, you find that the achievement is given more significance. So you were the first guy to do this. You got this as the richest person, and success is defined as something in terms of your rights and how you approach something. So I became this contradiction in the sense that my background there was always a lot of emphasis on being the one that respected the family name. You couldn't be the Roxon that didn't do something well. So everything that I did was monitored in the sense that I couldn't do things to shame the family. But as I started to get older, I started to really, find myself, and in the process of moving and going to all these countries, I got influenced. I was in an American international school. I started to do some individual things. I started to value achievement. I started to want to be the best at anything that I did. So it's always funny for me when I go back home. I always have that mental culture shift in my head. All right, I've got to remember, this is not about me. This is about what we're doing here as a family. Go home, go say that, and this is the Roxon. So, that's in essence how that contradiction comes into play. But as the world becomes more global and we become more globalized, how do you deal with people that have different cultural frames of reference from you? Say you are someone from a collectivist background, how would you deal with someone from an individualistic background? If you're someone from a collective background and you're teaching a bunch of individualists, then you can start to create a situation where the first person to answer this question, or the person that gets the answer to the hardest question, gets a certain amount of extra credit. If you're a teacher that was working with a bunch of collectivists, then you have to make it a situation where they come up with that group dynamic. So you set them up in groups, you ask them questions like, what did the group think of this? Why did the group respond to that answer? And that makes them more comfortable. This is often something that people in groups, especially as I've been in university here, it's always funny when I'm paired with people from different backgrounds and I see how they respond to group assignments, because some people dread it because they feel like the loudest voice is going to take credit for everything, and people, and sometimes that tends to look like the quiet person didn't do anything. So make that person in the collectivist environment feel like they were part of the bigger picture. And that's how you can get success. This is how you can negotiate with business. This is how you can interact with fellows and ladies from different backgrounds. Say you're in a business setting, you're in a meeting, and you're leading a bunch of collectivists. One thing that you can do is make sure you have clear instructions ahead of time. So if you're going to call out people, you're going to ask out names and say, hey, I would like Tony or like Lily to say something. Make sure it's been stated beforehand that you're going to actually call them out. So it's not something that you'd say, who has an opinion on this, and no one responds, because that way they know what to expect, and it doesn't look like they're outshining someone else, or they're stepping up and going outside of some of their comfort zone, really. So make sure you're very clear with the instructions. Make sure you let them know what the clear path of the meeting is going to be and what to expect. That way they feel comfortable, and they can go at that meeting feeling like the group achieved something as a dynamic and as a goal. with individualists, it's, this is very, very common in the Western culture. A lot of people that are not familiar with the Western culture sometimes, you've got things like sales quotas. In a sales environment, that's a subculture within any environment that encourages achievement, encourages rewards for getting that achievement, and also has people being recognized as, hey, Tony, once again as an example, was the highest selling salesperson this month. And last month it was Lily. That's a dynamic that's done. What happens though if you're in a sales environment and you're still in a collectivist culture? One thing that you can do is have sales teams, and that way a sales team wins versus a salesperson wins. So they're very, very subtle tricks that you can use between these environments. But one thing that I want to make clear is that there is not one society that's better than another. Japan, has a less individualistic mindset than America, but that doesn't mean they haven't achieved a lot of success. And it doesn't matter. Same thing goes back and forth for several countries. Whether it's the northern, whether it's Scandinavian countries, or whether it's Brazil, or whether it's Nigeria or South Africa, they've all achieved success within that, within whatever function that they believe in. The one thing that you should take is learn how to communicate across this culture, as opposed to say your culture is better than that. Learn how to embrace, learn how to flex a certain muscle, and then invite that, as opposed to saying, I can't believe that you didn't recognize this person, or why do we have to wait for this whole group to work together? Okay? So, are you an individualist? Are you a collectivist? I'd like to know. And if you are, a mix of both, please let me know as well, because I often have to flex both muscles, and I'm always curious to meet fellow people who've had to do that all their lives. So let me know in the comments below, or on my website, or any of the links that will be down below in the description box. Are you an individualist? Or are you a collectivist? Till next week. Use your difference to make a difference.
Use your difference to make a difference. How cool is that? Okay, let us go back, and I think I might be just about done with the information that I wanted to go over. This one is a little bit more complicated, so I might introduce this one again next week. There is always an ongoing blended learning activity that I want you to be reminded about. You will be working with Samantha, of course. Some of you have worked with her already this week, but she will post the Zoom address that you will need to make sure that you have the information of where to log in to work with your blended team activity. And make sure if you have any comments or if you have questions, you can contact me as well. But Samantha will definitely be taking the lead on these blended learning activities. Okay, well, we've learned quite a bit having to do with some of these traits, learning some skills, learning some new types of language that we can apply, having to do with individualistic views and collectivist views. So yeah, some of these definitions just, you've already been introduced to most of these, so I just wanted to make sure that you are familiar with them. Additionally, you do have your quiz that is due by October 4th. So make sure that you stay current on that. Yeah, some of these images just kind of help to illustrate a little bit more of the meaning behind and definition. So we are about to close, so I really appreciate your time today, and I will look forward to specifically seeing you next week. Stay safe, and if you have any questions, this is a good time for us to take questions and or comments and some of the takeaways from today. Okay.